download our Revise It Right revision app for hundreds of videos, quizzes, exam questions, tutor support and so much more. This video is about mixtures and chromatography. Now a mixture is at least two different elements or compounds, and you'll see that in a second, joined together. They can be separated easily. Okay, now remember in a previous video that an element was only made up of one compound. So if I draw here some gold, and all of these are gold atoms, then that is a gold element. Remember, however, a compound was at least two or more different elements chemically joined. So we looked at water, which is H2O. Okay, we can see these are chemically joined and they are different. Okay, they're two different types. So this is water and it's a compound. And obviously gold is an element. Whereas a mixture is at least two different elements or compounds that are not chemically joined together. Now a good example of a mixture is air. Now we know that air is made up of plenty of nitrogen. Lots of nitrogen in the air. But also in the air you find oxygen, O2. You also find carbon dioxide in the air as well, which is CO2. And you also find some argon in the air and plenty of other gases you find in the air. Now we can see this is a mixture of elements. So we've got nitrogen here, which is an element, oxygen here, which is an element, because that's only made up of nitrogen or oxygen. And argon here is an element, but it's also got a compound in there, which is carbon dioxide. So it's made up of two or more different elements that are not chemically joined together. So this nitrogen is not chemically joined to carbon dioxide, which is not chemically joined to the oxygen. They are separate. Okay, and that's really, really important. So this here is a mixture, and what we've actually got here is air. Now, a big difference between a mixture and a compound is that the properties within these elements or compounds are the same, whether they're in the mixture or not. And what I mean by that is oxygen doesn't change its properties, so it's still a gas, for example, even though it's in the mixture with the other elements or compounds in air. The same for nitrogen, that doesn't change its properties. Whereas, remember when we talked about water, hydrogen is actually a gas and oxygen is also a gas, but when they form to make water, they're actually a liquid. So the properties change in a compound, but they do not change in a mixture. So that's one difference. The second difference is that compounds cannot be separated easily. They need to go through a chemical reaction to be separated, whereas mixtures can be separated easily. Okay, now we're going to talk over the next few videos about different ways that we can separate mixtures. Remember to download our Revise It Right revision app, watch over 700 videos, answer 4,000 plus quiz questions, over 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 exam questions, worksheets, forums, and get help from qualified teachers and so much more. The link is in the description. Now the first way is using chromatography, and we can use this to separate a mixture of dyes in ink. Okay, so used to separate a mixture of dyes in ink. So in chromatography, and you may have done this at school, you have a beaker and you have some filter paper and you have some form of a solvent. Okay, now that solvent can most of the time be water. Water is a good solvent, but it also sometimes could be, if water isn't good for a particular substance, a particular mixture, it could be something like ethanol as well. Don't worry too much about that. You don't really have to know the ins and outs of that, but just be aware that water can be used as a solvent, but also ethanol as well. So this here, we've got the beaker and we've got our filter paper here. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the steps really of chromatography. So step one, you're going to draw a line near the bottom of a sheet of paper. So ideally you do this before placing it into your beaker. So you're going to draw a line over your filter paper nearer the bottom. Okay, so near the bottom. Then you also, the thing is that with this though, you do need to make sure that this line is not in the solvent. So can you see here, the solvent is here, and I've done it above the line, above the solvent. So do make sure that line that you draw is not in the solvent. Then what you want to do is you want to add a spot of ink. So I'm going to do some yellow ink onto your solvent line. So add a spot of ink onto your solvent. Okay, so what we did in step 1 was we drew a line on the paper, and in step 2 we added our ink, or a spot of ink, to that line. Okay, and as I said, you want to then place that into a solvent in a beaker. And I did say, remember, that this can mostly be water, but it could also be ethanol as well. And as I also said, and I'll make sure I say it again, do make sure the ink is not touching the solvent. So make sure that line and the ink is not touching your water. You're then going to place a lid over your beaker, like I've done there. So place a lid, and I'm just very quickly summarising the steps here. So place a lid over the container to stop the solvent from evaporating. That's why we do that. Okay. Now what's going to happen is the solvent, i.e. the water, is going to start moving up the filter paper. Okay, so this solvent here is going to start moving up the filter paper. Okay, so that's what's going to happen after some time. Okay, then next what's going to happen is that each of the colours that you find within the dye are also going to start moving up with it. Okay, so the ink will start moving up as well. So the ink will start moving up with the solvent. Now this is the important bit, that each different dye within the ink will move up the paper at a different rate and will therefore separate out. So for example, if that yellow ink was made up of red and green, then what would happen is the red ink would make its way to here, for example, whereas the green ink would make its way to here, for example. Okay, because they dissolve differently. They will move up the paper at different rates, and that will then separate them out. So we can now see that the red and the green inks have been separated out. Okay, so just to clarify, each different dye in the ink will move up the paper at a different rate. If any of the dyes in the ink are insoluble, i.e. they don't dissolve, they'll stay at the line. They'll stay on the baseline here. That's important to understand. So each colour will move up the paper at a different rate, but if an ink doesn't dissolve, then it will stay on the line. So what you then want to do is when the solvent has nearly reached the top, so when the solvent has nearly reached the top, you want to take out the paper to let it dry. So you want to take out the paper. Okay, and finally this paper here, what's left, the results, essentially the filter paper, we call a chromatogram. A chromatogram. Okay, that's essentially the results of chromatography. That's what you get after. Okay, so essentially, very, very briefly, you draw a line on your filter paper, you add some ink, and you place this in your solvent, making sure that the line and the ink are not touching the solvent. The solvent will move up the paper. As it does this, the ink will start moving up with it. Different inks dissolve at different rates, therefore some will move higher up the paper than others. This is separating them out. Once the solvent has nearly reached the top, we're going to take out the paper, and this result will be the chromatogram. So I want you to now have a go at answering these questions. So if you pause the video, we'll go through the answers after. So pause the video now. Okay, so question 1. What is a mixture? Well, a mixture is a substance that contains 2 or more chemical elements, so 2 or more elements or compounds, because we saw in air it can be elements and compounds or both. So 2 or more elements or compounds that are not They're not chemically joined. And one important thing to add with a mixture is that they can therefore be separated easily. They can be separated easily. So what does chromatography separate? Well, it separates inks or different inks in dyes. The inks in dyes. So different colour inks and dyes. What type of paper do you use for paper chromatography? We use filter paper. What can you use for a solvent in chromatography? Well, you can mostly use water, but occasionally you can also use ethanol. And how does chromatography work? Well, it works on the basis that different colour inks will dissolve at different rates. Therefore, separating out on the filter paper. So that's how it works. Okay, so different colour inks will dissolve at different rates, therefore separating out on the filter paper. So we've now looked at mixtures in chromatography. So you can now move on to test yourself using the quiz and answering the exam questions as well. If there was anything you found difficult in this particular topic, or you don't understand anything, then please get into contact with one of our tutors and we'll be happy to help.